going to begin today by reading the next passage of A New Earth. And we've reached the passage called The Collective Ego. How hard it is to live with yourself. One of the ways in which the ego attempts to escape the unsatisfactoriness of personal selfhood is to enlarge and strengthen its sense of self by identifying with a group, a nation, political party, corporation, institution, sect, club, gang, football team. In some cases, the personal ego seems to dissolve completely as someone dedicates his or her life to working selflessly for the greater good of the collective without demanding personal rewards, recognition, or aggrandizement. What a relief to be freed of the dreadful burden of personal self. The members of the collective feel happy and fulfilled. No matter how hard they work, how many sacrifices they make, they appear to have gone beyond ego. The question is, have they truly become free, or has the ego simply shifted from the personal to the collective? A collective ego manifests the same characteristics as the personal ego, such as the need for conflict and enemies, the need for more, the need to be right against others who are wrong, and so on. Sooner or later, the collective will come into conflict with other collectives because it unconsciously seeks conflict and it needs opposition to define its boundary and thus its identity. Its members will then experience the suffering that invariably comes in the wake of any ego-motivated action. At that point, they may wake up and realize their collective has a strong element of insanity. It can be at first to suddenly wake up and realize that the collective you had identified with and worked for is actually insane. Some people at that point become cynical or bitter and henceforth deny all values, all worth. This means that they quickly adopted another belief system when the previous one was recognized as illusory and therefore collapsed. They didn't face the death of their ego, but ran away and reincarnated into a new one. A collective ego is usually more unconscious than the individuals that make up that ego. For example, crowds, which are temporary collective ego entities, are capable of committing atrocities that the individual away from the crowd would not be. Nations not infrequently engage in behavior that would be immediately recognizable as psychopathic in an individual. As the new consciousness emerges, some people will feel called upon to form groups that reflect the enlightened consciousness. These groups will not be collective egos. The individuals who make up these groups will have no need to define their identity through them. They no longer look to any form to define who they are. Even if the members that make up those groups are not totally free of ego yet, there will be enough awareness in them to recognize the ego in themselves or in others as soon as it appears. However, constant alertness is required, since the ego will try to take over and reassert itself in any way it can. Dissolving the human ego by bringing it into the light of awareness. This will be one of the main purposes of these groups, whether they be enlightened businesses, charitable organizations, schools, or communities of people living together. Enlightened collectives will fulfill an important function in the arising of the new consciousness, just as egoic collectives pull you into unconsciousness and suffering. The enlightened collective can be a vortex for consciousness that will accelerate the planetary shift. So, just to touch upon that passage before we move on, there has been much discussion on the collective ego. In previous passages, there has been mention of perhaps the negativity that comes from the collective ego, the amplification of this energy and the insanity of it. A word that was mentioned 2 or more times in just this last passage, and it seems like a very accurate word. There is no stability in egoic energy. It is almost like, perhaps the egoic energy is like almost a hurricane. It is a powerful, destructive, self-energizing force. Disempowering from the clarity of reality, of what is in this moment. And here there is mention of groups or a collective ego that, or I should say, groups that where there is no collective ego, even with those individuals who may still be challenged by ego, there is alertness there. There is a catching oneself when the ego arises. And it shows the evolution of consciousness. And it says here, enlightened collectives, those who gather in this way, will fulfill an important function in the arising of the new consciousness. And new being, this is something Eckhart mentioned in a video I watched recently, new being that it's not just being created, but it's newly experienced. So for those where consciousness that is always there, it is the only truth in this way, the permanence of consciousness. It has been covered up completely, and now there is light breaking through the clouds. There is a newness to the experience of consciousness. And we move on to the next passage, which is titled Incontrovertible Proof of Immortality. Ego comes about through a split in the human psyche, in which identity separates into two parts that we could call I and me, or me and myself. Every ego is therefore schizophrenic, to use the word in its popular meaning of split personality. You live with a mental image of yourself, a conceptual self that you have a relationship with. Life itself becomes conceptualized and separated from who you are when you speak of my life. The moment you say or think my life and believe in what you are saying, rather than it just being a linguistic convention, you have entered the realm of delusion. If there is such a thing as my life, it follows that I and life are two separate things, and so I can also lose my life, my imaginary treasured possession. Death becomes a seeming reality and a threat. Words and concepts split life into separate segments that have no reality in themselves. We could even say that the notion my life is the original delusion of separateness, the source of ego. If I and life are two, if I am separate from life, then I am separate from all things, all beings, all people. But how could I be separate from life? What I could there be apart from life, apart from being? It is utterly impossible. So there is no such thing as my life, and I don't have a life. I am life. I and life are one. It cannot be otherwise. So how could I lose my life? How can I lose something that I don't have in the first place? How can I lose something that I am? It is impossible. And this brings us to the end of the passage and also the end of the chapter as well. So perhaps this is a good place to pause the reading for this episode. And also with this last passage, it is perhaps good to just allow some time to absorb and reflect. And I mean reflect not in a way of figuring things out, but reflect in terms of allowing those words to settle, to consciously allow the words in the spaciousness of being in a present moment. So the so-called normality of my life there is a good chance that if you go to a cafe or perhaps people you know, friends, family, there is a good chance that there is I and life, or there is my life. It is something that we are raised upon, this notion, this conceptuality of my life. And it makes perfect sense in one way, since consciousness is flowering, but perhaps there's no way to give a percentage, but it is easy to see there is much unconsciousness around us. Even in the home you are living in, perhaps the job you go to, maybe with friends, there is not an awareness there. There is me and my life, the separateness. And of course, in this way, you have given a temporary condition to that. There is a wanting of permanence in a temporary changing concept of my life. And the delusion is that you can never find my life. You can never show it. You can never experience my life. And it is easy to see the mental structure that the my life concept is made of, the name, the perhaps nationality, even race, family. And I'm meaning this in terms of labels, the labeling of this. And these web of labels is my life, memories, what I like or don't like, opinions and judgments of people, what they did to me, what shouldn't have happened, the drama of my life. And in the wholeness, the totality of now, of the present moment, and there is no separateness, there is nothing to separate. It is almost as if the separateness is a language of the mind, concepts, thoughts, ideas. It is the nature of this. But in the wholeness, no such concepts can survive. They cannot reach the present moment. They cannot be found. And this can be discovered for yourself as you listen. As you listen to the voice, as you are aware of the space around the voice. As you are aware of your body, the spaciousness around where you are located. Sense perceptions being observed, the listening, the seeing. It is a background of stillness, of silence. And then the form arising within it through sounds, through change, thoughts, perceptions. They cannot exist without the conscious awareness. Just like a painting cannot exist without a canvas, thoughts, perceptions, ideas, they cannot exist without consciousness. But consciousness doesn't need anything to be. Never created. And it cannot die, as it is mentioned here with the separateness of my life. There is a me that is separate to everything. So the fear of death is losing the fear of the conceptual reality you think you have. This could be, relationships, family. And how can anything be lost in the whole? Just as a drop merges into the ocean, the drop in this way as, how can this be said? or the drop has never left the ocean. There is the thought of the separateness. Perhaps a better analogy is the waves in the ocean, the waves, the arising of forms, life, and then the merging back into the ocean. But it never leaves, it's never separate from the ocean. The wave may have a thought of my life as it arises out of the ocean. It looks at other waves and sees or thinks the separateness, the idea of me and my life. But as you can see, it arises out of the totality and returns back to the totality. So I hope that analogy is clear when we talk about the example Eckhart has mentioned of the delusion of me and my life. So we'll return to this on another episode, and we will be moving on to chapter 5, which is titled The Pain Body. So this is something that's been touched upon within Eckhart's first book, The Power of Now, and it has also, I'm sure, been referenced in previous episodes of me sharing perhaps some of my own experiences or dealing with my pain body. And I don't mean mine as in a personal pain body, just the way language is in this way. And perhaps I can share a little bit about pain body of my experience this week. And pain body is recognized often when there is an overreaction to something. So something, an action that may occur that may be painful, may be unpleasant, and it almost triggers the residue of pain inside you, the collective residue of past pain. That can be called the pain body, a trapped energy. And what I've observed this week is just the destructiveness or the impact of just a single thought. We may have, hundreds, and I don't know if it's thousands. Let's just say we have many thoughts each day, many thoughts. And often the thoughts may just create little ripples on the surface. We jump from one thought to another. But the thought can have the ability to, if you are not aware, it can trigger an enormous amount of pain. So instead of, if there were some small rocks being thrown in the water that may create some disturbance, this may be a boulder or an iceberg crashing into the water, creating this huge wave this huge reaction. So, as an example, there could be an instance of, let's just say, of you being ignored, or perhaps even being ignored is a mental complaint. That could perhaps be if someone doesn't respond in a time that you expect them to. Let's say a day passes, 2 days, and you don't hear from them. There's no response to a message. And instead of just the reaction of that action, the reaction of the labeling or the conceptual idea of being ignored, the mental thought, where perhaps that may provoke annoyance, or there may be some judgments of that person, maybe even worry as well of how they haven't responded. And there may be a thought of, well, perhaps my life is not worth anything. It may not be phrased in this way, but there may be a thought which brings with it years of pain, trauma. Just by this one action, it can suddenly leap to not just this one instance of not receiving a response, it can go to nobody ever loves me. The thought of that. And it may again not be phrased in this way, but the body may react as if this was true, and it provokes all of the past pain arises. And it is so fast that as the action happens, the pain body responds, it reacts, it becomes alive. And I'm sure as we will read on the chapter, it is being alert to this sudden tidal wave of pain that wants to create more pain. It wants to, Eckhart often phrases it as feed on pain. It wants to feed and create more painful thoughts. It's almost an entity that wants to stay alive, and the aliveness comes in the sustaining of thoughts, creating thoughts. In this instance, it's the I'm not worthy of love. And you may look for examples of that being true, and you may bring up past relationships and memories, and they left me, and this person, and that person, and so on. And so for me, there was a thought that it triggered an enormous amount of pain. You could almost feel the constriction of the energy. For me, it was in my chest. And perhaps there could be words. There were no thoughts at the time, it was just the pain arising. But if I was to add words to it, it would be perhaps something along the lines of not feeling worthy, of not feeling valued. Perhaps there was a thought, or if I was to describe it, of not getting the desire that I've wanted for so long, and it's oh, it's not quite happening again. So a huge influx of pain. And there was a realization of how easy it was to slip into thoughts, creating more thoughts, and adding to this huge wave of pain, instead of just remaining in the alertness, the observation of the pain. And as for me, as I experienced, it was so easy to slip into it, and then to come out of it. Sometimes it took some time. It wasn't something I could just simply wake up from. Sometimes when the feeding of pain happens in thoughts, it's almost too late. Then there is now the only opportunity to come out of that is when it is fed enough on your thoughts, and then you may come out of it to think, oh, and there's a realization of what has just occurred, the losing of consciousness and the feeding of the pain body, of the amplification of adding to the pain, chewing over thoughts, creating even more emotions, more pain. And it can happen in an instant. Even just recording, a similar thought arose, and immediately the pain was there, was bubbling on the surface, and then I was able to drop the thought, to step into awareness, and slowly the wave receded. It didn't take over. So this is something to be aware of. Pain body, the overreaction. And it's not about perfecting or never being caught out of it. It is just the nature of human pain. Where most of us enter this world, and there is painful situations, trauma that is unresolved, and then there is the understanding of this, and now there is the understanding of what needs to be done, or what can be done when this pain arises, the alertness and the observation of the sensation of the pain body, and allowing it to dissolve. You are not pushing down the pain, you are not blocking or avoiding, you are simply allowing it to enter the space of your awareness. And yes, at times you may be pulled into the pain body, and then as it goes through its cycle, its process, you come out and realize what's happened. And you may learn what triggers there are for your pain body. And then there'll be moments when you see it, as I said, bubble up to the surface, and then you catch it before it takes over. But again, it's just back to the simplicity of just being aware of the present moment. all of this is taken care of. There is a natural knowing. There is an infinite capacity in the awareness when remaining there, of observing the pain that arises. So I will end this episode here. Thank you for joining me and for being with me in this moment, and I will speak to you again very soon. Take care.